So before we get started in chapter 12, just to kind of give you a recap of where we're at, in chapter 6 and on in chapter 7, we saw where the wall was finally finished. That 52 days of work was completed, and that all took place, from opening words of Nehemiah to when the wall was finished is probably 9 months or something. When you've got the 3 or so months that he is praying and waiting, you've probably got another 3 months that he's traveling to Jerusalem, and then you've got that 52 days, plus or minus whatever days directly before and after the building of the wall. And then in chapter 8, we saw what was amazing is that now that the physical labor was done, they started doing the right thing. Now that they had the city, now that they had the infrastructure, now that they had the people there ready to go, they were doing the right thing, and they gathered, and the entire group, all the Israelites in that area got together, and they simply read the book of the law. And then they read, we're supposed to do such and such a feast. So they followed it out, and for an entire week, they were looking into the law of God over and over and over again. And then what we saw is that in, I believe it was chapter 8, the Israelites came to Ezra, and they came they came fasting and in the sackcloth and with dust on their heads, and they said, "We've realized something terrible. There's all these things in the book of the law we haven't been following." And so we saw that huge, awesome prayer that they led that was them rededicating themselves to God. And not only did they have a huge, congregational prayer about it, but then they looked at it and they said, okay, we're not just going to say this in a prayer. We're going to commit ourselves to an oath. We're going to put it down on paper. We're going to sign our names to this, that we're going to follow these things. And then they listed out all the aspects of their life that was going to change because of what they've realized from the book of the law. So then in chapter 11, we just kind of saw some logistical things. The city's growing. They're trying to get people to move to the city. There's new positions. There's new managers over new groups of people. And just a bunch of change like that. In chapter 12, I'm just going to start reading here in verse 1. Now these are the priests and the Levites who came up with Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua. And I'm going to pause there. What chapter 12 starts off with is another big list. And this is one of the things I've kind of wrestled with teaching this class, is what to do with all these lists, because we don't really write that way. If I was going to go tell somebody, let's say 1,000 years from now, about what's going on now, I probably wouldn't give a list, of every member in the congregation, and then, 2 chapters later, give a whole nother list of every member of the congregation 70 years ago, and then in 2 chapters later, give you a list of maybe just the deacons and elders 70 years ago. But that's what Nehemiah is doing. And so I've wrestled with, what's going on here? What's Nehemiah actually getting at? What's he working on with all this? And I want to give you guys an example that helps me to make sense of it. As I've worked in Starbucks now and seen different managers over different times, what I find is more and more, if you go to a store, that store is a representative of its manager. If the manager is one that's really just kind of laid back and chill and really relaxed, and you look at all the baristas that they hire and the way that the baristas act, that whole store is going to be really chill, really laid back, really relaxed. You can kind of see how that manager will set the tone. If you go to a store where the manager is really strict and really uptight, you might notice that the baristas are more strict and more uptight. And as I see more and more managers, I see every time, if you can learn what the manager's like, you can figure everything else out because it all trickles down from there. Well, right now, our manager is leaving. She put in, I guess, a 4-week notice, for lack of a better term, that she was going to be stepping down and moving to a lower position. And our district manager is going to have to bring in a new manager who probably won't know any of us. And if that manager is smart, before they start making decisions, before they start saying, this is the direction we're heading, this is what we're doing, this is how I run things, if that manager's smart, he'll ask us what our last manager was like, what our last manager was making policies about, what our last manager motivated people to do, what they did poorly, what they did well. Because all those things trickle down to the rest of us in the way we're going to perform and the things that are going to upset us and the things that won't upset us. But if that manager's really smart, they won't just ask about our last manager, they'll ask about even the one before her. because that manager had a very different personality, and that manager happened to hire about half of us baristas. And so all those people that manager is going to be working with us now, we're all products of two different managers over the course of 5 or so years. Here's Nehemiah. He started out in Persia, and he's stepping into Jerusalem, and he's only been here for probably 6 months or so now. And he's dealing with people that are reeling from things for years and years and years. And so not only is it smart for him to look back one generation and say, okay, so who was in charge here? What was going on here? I'm going to look back one generation. It may be even smart for him to look back 2 or 3 generations. And so when we look at this account, look what he's doing here. In chapter 12, verse 1, it's this big list of people, and it starts with Zerubbabel and Jeshua. Those are the people that came about 70 years ago. When you look at verse 12, we're going to see another time frame. It says, now in the days of Joachim, the priests, the heads of the fathers' households, and a whole bunch more names. And then when you go in verse 22, as for the Levites, the heads of the fathers' households, who were registered in the days of Eliashib. If you go back to verse 10, we see a little verse here. It says, Jeshua became the father of Joachim, and Joachim became the father of Eliashib, and Eliashib became the father of Joiada, and it goes on. What he's actually doing here is not just writing down some dead list just to have some dead list that doesn't make a difference. He's actually tracking back 3 generations and saying, okay, so this guy was the high priest when you guys all came down here. And under him was this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy. Okay, so then now he had a son, and this son was going to be the high priest. And he had these guys all under him. And you know, this guy, oh, he's the uncle of this guy's family with this guy. And he's putting it all in place. And then finally, when it gets down to Eliashib, that's the high priest in his very own time. And so just like it's wise for a manager to come in and say, okay, who was here before, what happened? It's wise for Nehemiah as he's trying to build this city, as he's trying to get it to run properly and orchestrate all the Levites and the priests to say, okay, before I do all this stuff, who are the priests? And who are the priests before them? And who are the priests before them? And so we see it all kind of add together in that way. And then in verse 27, it's going to carry on. And again, just like last week, we're covering 2 chapters, so I'm not going to read every verse in those lists. So we're going to skip ahead to 27 now. The first 26 verses are just lists of the names of those people. Verse 27, now, at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought out the Levites from all their places to bring them to Jerusalem so that they might celebrate the dedication with gladness, with hymns of thanksgiving, with songs of accompaniment of cymbals, harps, and lyres. So the sons of the singers were assembled from the district around Jerusalem and from the villages of the Netophathites, from Beth Gilgal, and from their fields in Geba and Asmaveth, for the singers had built themselves villages around Jerusalem. The priests and the Levites purified themselves. They also purified the people, the gates, and the wall. So we can see this direct corollary. Nehemiah's just put together this big list of all the priests and Levites, and now they're actually going to work here. What they're going to do is have a big, huge ceremony for the dedication of the wall. This is one of those things, too, where it doesn't really resonate with me when I read it. What's a dedication of a wall? Like what is that? Because in our culture, I feel like we don't do that very much. Like, we dedicate books to people, and in the first couple pages, it'll say, this is dedicated to my daughter, or this is dedicated to so-and-so. So we do that, but, I mean, when we move into a house, we may have a housewarming party, but we don't say, we're having a dedication party, and we're dedicating our house to God. But the interesting thing about that culture is they did that a lot. You can actually look back in Deuteronomy 20 if you want at some point, and it has this little snippet that says, if you go off to war and you haven't dedicated your house to the Lord, what if you die? Is somebody else going to come and dedicate your house? And so we can see just this kind of culture that whatever they had, if you had a house, if you had land, if you had sheep, whatever you have, it's this attitude of, I realize that this came from God. I realize that it's because of him that I have it. So I'm going to formally announce that this is going to be used to glorify God and not other things. Another example that kind of, I guess, just resonates with me is one time I was at Giorgio's, a sub shop that used to be over by Blockbuster, and I was talking to the owner, and he gave me a 10% discount, and because he saw I was studying my Bible, and I was like, oh, okay. And he's like, this is the Lord's restaurant. And while that 10% discount is pointless, it really struck me that he took his restaurant and he looked at it and he said, I got this restaurant because of God, and I'm going to use it to serve God. And so here we see kind of that same attitude that we've seen all through the book of Nehemiah, how God has been behind this whole thing. And so now here they're having this huge ceremony, and they're getting together all the priests and Levites, and they're organizing them all so they can clearly state this wall is to be used for God. On in verse 31, we start to see kind of how big of a deal this is. Verse 31, and I'll read through 37. Then I had the leaders of Judah come up on top of the wall, and I appointed 2 great choirs, the first proceeding to the right on top of the wall toward the refuse gate. Hoshea and half of the leaders of Judah followed them, with Azariah, Ezra, Meshullam, Judah, Benjamin, Shemaiah, Jeremiah, and some of the sons of the priests with trumpets. And Zechariah, the son of Jonathan, the son of Shemaiah, the son of Mattaniah, the son of Micaiah, the son of Zakur, the son of Asaph, and his kinsmen, Shemaiah, Azarel, Milaliah, Galilai, Maiah, Nethanel, Judah, and Hanani, with the musical instruments of David, the man of God. And Ezra the scribe went before them. At the fountain gate they went directly up the steps of the city of David by the stairway of the wall above the house of David to the water gate on the east. Verses 38 through 43 are going to cover more details, but I'm not going to read through those. But what we see here is just this big, huge thing that they're taking 2 entire choirs and sending them out on top of the wall to different sides to have this big musical ceremony so that they can sing praises to God. And so you can read through 38 through 44 if you want, but the end of it really, it gets summed up in verse 33. It says, and on that day they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced because God had given them great joy. Even the women and children rejoiced so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard from afar. And so here we see that this isn't a solemn event. This one is particularly joyous. And I kind of think of it the same way as when we look at giving in the New Testament, we're told to give cheerfully. And it's like, well, how can we give cheerfully? We're taking something that's ours and we're giving it away, so we're supposed to be cheerful about it. The reason we can be cheerful about giving is because we realize that the money we already have was already God's to begin with. If we give, let's say, 15% of our money, that other 85%, we're fooling ourselves if we say, that's mine. So 15% is God's and 85% is mine. That's wrong. It's all God's to begin with. And so the same thing here, when they're taking this wall and they're giving it up to God, they're dedicating it to God, it's not sad because it's not like they're taking something that's theirs and losing it. They're taking something that's God's to begin with and saying, it's amazing that God has done this work in us and we're going to use it for his glory. In verse 44, I'm going to start reading there. On that day, men were also appointed over the chambers for the stores, the contributions, the first fruits, and the tithes, to gather into them from the fields of the cities of the portions required by the law of the priests and Levites. For Judah rejoiced over the priests and Levites who served. For they performed the worship of their God and the service of purification, together with the singers and the gatekeepers, in accordance with the command of David and of his son Solomon. For in the days of David and Asaph in ancient times, there were leaders of the singers, songs of praise and hymns and thanksgiving to God. So all Israel in days of Zerubbabel and Nehemiah gave the portions due the singers and the gatekeepers as each day required, and set apart the consecrated portion of for the Levites, and the Levites set apart the consecrated portion for the sons of Aaron. So what it's saying here is, first of all, the Levites and the priests were taken care of, and the people were motivated to take care of them because they were actually, the Levites were doing the work that they were supposed to. They were actually leading these religious services. And it says in verse 44 that Judah rejoiced over them. So this is all a happy thing. And they're saying, yes, of course we'll give 1/10 of what we make to you guys. And then the Levites take 1/10 of what they make and pass it on to the priests. They're saying, of course we'll do that. You guys are up here. You're helping us with these ceremonies. You're helping us uphold the law. This is great. Of course we're going to fund you guys. And so it concludes by saying, all in the days of Zerubbabel and Nehemiah, that 70-ish year time frame, the Levites and priests were taken care of. And then in 13, it moves on. And I'm actually going to go through 13 verse 3, and then we're going to pause and cover the rest of 13, because 13 verse 3 is really where the transition goes from chapter 12 to 13. Chapter 13 here in the beginning is going to be talking about the same section of time. Chapter 13 verse 1. On that day they read aloud from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and there was found written in it that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, because they did not meet the sons of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, our God turned the curse into a blessing. So when they heard the law, they excluded all foreigners from Israel. There's a couple things we see going on here. First of all, if you want to see more about Balaam and that story and what's going on there, you can look it up in Numbers 22 through 24. We're not going to go there, but if you want to get more details about what's going on there, it's Numbers 22 through 24. The other thing that's impressive to me is, number one, they're continually going back and reading from the law. At all these times they get together, they're continually going back and say, we're going to absorb more of the law. What does it say? What does it say? What does it say? The other thing that's impressive to me is, in chapter 10, we saw all these changes, and they listed out, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, because we got all of that, we found it in the law, we need to be doing it. What's great is they don't walk away from that and say, okay, we're done improving. So we just need to do those 4 things. We can check them off the list, and then we're good. That means we're serving God. I mean, we made this oath. After reading the law, we'll just follow it, and we're good. Here we see another case where they're looking into it, and they're going, oh, we didn't realize this before. This is another thing that we're not doing in following the law. And so they're taking all those people out from the land and out from the congregation because of what they've read. And again, it's easy to read these and just think that's just something you do. You just flip a switch and you say, okay, all the Ammonites and whoever else, you guys can't be a part of this. Flip the switch, it's done. But that'd probably be a pretty painful process, because you've got all these people who are of that nationality, and they're saying, but wait, you've let us be a part before. I mean, what's different now? Really, you're just going to change on us like that? We've been here with you guys. We've been supporting you guys. There's probably all that explanation. But nonetheless, they followed what the Word of God said. So that more or less ends chapter 12. We're going to move on to chapter 13. Chapter 13, very different from any of the other chapters in the book of Nehemiah. So the first 12 chapters take up that 12 years. And then what happens is Nehemiah was the governor. His reign there ends. And just like in chapter 1, he said that he gave the king an appointed time that he would head back to Persia. In chapter 13, we see Nehemiah head back to Persia. And so he goes off and he's with the king again. And later, once he's been there for some time, he gets leave and goes back to Jerusalem to kind of check up, see how things are going. We don't know how long this is. A lot of people estimate like 1 to 7 years, but really there's nothing in the text. We don't know. I mean, for all I know, it could be 20 years. It could be however long. But for some portion of time, he leaves the people in Jerusalem and he lets them run for themselves, and then he's going to come back. And the biggest thing that I take away, there was something my dad told me once. He went on a vacation, just kind of like Nehemiah's leaving, his job. He's going back home for a while. My dad went on a vacation. It was a business meeting, so it wasn't a full vacation. But when he was there, they were at some sort of seminar or classes or whatever. And this guy next to him, every 5 minutes had to get up and take a phone call. And then he'd come back and sit back down, and he'd have to get up and take a phone call. And then he'd sit back down, and he'd have to get up and take a phone call over and over and over. And my dad, who just like him was a chief engineer of this big building, they both had the same position. My dad never had to take a phone call. He just sat at the seminar, he listened, he learned, whatever. So this guy looks and he goes, how come you're not having to answer calls from your employees all day? And my dad said, well, I just trained them to be able to run the business without me. I mean, I taught him everything I know, so if I'm gone, there's nothing that I can do that they can't. I mean, I've put it all in their hands. They're capable. And my dad taught me something that really stuck with me. He said, there's 2 types of people. There's the type of person that in business puts out fires, and that's the guy on the phone. He's constantly putting out fires. He said there's another type that keeps the fires from happening. He said, before I went on that vacation, I did all the preventative maintenance. I did everything that needed to be done so there wouldn't be fires while I was gone. When you look at what Nehemiah's done, that's exactly what he's done. He's put everybody in their place. He's elected the right people to the right positions. He's got them all going back to the Word of God. He's done everything right in that way. But that's why chapter 13 is so striking. Because I'm of the persuasion that I like to think that if I do my job right, if I'm in charge of people and I set them all up right, if I do everything perfect, I can walk away and I can come back and everything will be fine. And a lot of times in life, that happens. But it's sad because chapter 13 isn't like that. It's actually a really, really sad ending. It's a really hard way to end this book. Chapter 13 and verse 4. Now prior to this, Eliashib, the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, being related to Tobiah, had repaired a large room for him. And I'm going to pause there. Tobiah. It was a name that we saw from chapters 1 to 6 over and over and over again. Tobiah and Sanballat were those two guys that Nehemiah could never get rid of. And over he would do something to put them at bay and to quelch whatever they were trying to start up. And he managed it, and he kept them at bay. But here we see that Tobiah is married into the family of the high priest. It's like a thorn in the flesh. It's like a foot in the door. He's married into more or less the royal family, as it were. He's married in there. Look at chapter 13 and skip ahead to verse 28. Verse 28, so first we were talking about Sanballat, or about Tobiah, and then here in verse 28, even one of the sons of Joiada, the son of Eliashib the high priest, was a son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite, so I drove him away from me. So Sanballat and Tobiah are both relatives of the high priest. There's a lot of talk about intermarrying in this time, and they weren't supposed to do it. The Jews were not supposed to intermarry. Yet people of even the high priest's family had intermarried. And now Sanballat and Tobiah, who were normally not Jews, have married into the Jewish family in a way they weren't supposed to. And I just want to go back to Ezra. And let me find chapter 10 and verse 2. We can see something about this. Ezra chapter 10, starting in verse 2. Starts with Shechaniah. And if you trace who Shechaniah is, this is actually one of the guys whose family married into Sanballat and Tobiah's group. This is one of those guys. In verse 2, Shechaniah the son of Jehiel, one of the sons of Elam, said to Ezra, "We have been unfaithful to our God and have married foreign women from the peoples of the land, yet now there is hope for Israel in spite of this. So now let us make a covenant with our God to put away all the wives and their children, according to the counsel of my Lord and of those who tremble at the commandment of our God. And let it be done according to the law. Arise, for this matter is your responsibility, but we will be with you. Be courageous and act." So what we see here is Eliashib and some others realize that the daughters of Jerusalem have been marrying people that they should never have. And they say, you know what? We're going to make an oath. We're going to make an oath to cast all them off so that they're no longer a part of Jerusalem and they won't be an issue. The thing is, that's an oath that they ignored. Because in Nehemiah, we see Sanballat and Tobiah coming up over and over and over again. And here we see them in chapter 13, that they're married in. They haven't been cast off. They're still there. And just like if there's a little bit of leaven in bread and you can't get it out, it's going to leaven the whole lump. So I'm going to start reading now, verses 4 through 9. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and start in 7 because we've covered most of the verses before that. If you want to read at some point, verse 6 will describe Nehemiah's, his leave to go back to Persia. But in verse 7, "And I came to Jerusalem and learned about the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah by preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God. It was very displeasing to me, so I threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room. Then I gave an order that they cleanse the rooms, and I returned there the utensils of the house of God with the grain offerings and the frankincense." So Tobiah is basically snuck in. He's friends, buddy with Eliashib. And so Eliashib says, "Oh, you want a room in the temple too? Okay, I'll give you that." And so all the things that are normally set apart for God in this room have been pulled out, and Tobiah's just been freeloading and putting all his stuff in there and using the space. So Nehemiah comes very angry and literally throws it out. So, first part of chapter 13, the temple is ignored. Verse 10. I also discovered that the portions of the Levites had not been given them, so that the Levites and the singers who performed the service had gone away, each to his own field. So I reprimanded the officials and said, "Why is the house of God forsaken?" Then I gathered them together and restored them to their posts. All Judah then brought the tithe of the grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses. In charge of the storehouses I appointed Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, Pedaiah of the Levites, and in addition to them was Hanan the son of Zakur, the son of Mattaniah, for they were considered reliable, and it was their task to distribute to their kinsmen. Remember me for this, O my God, and do not blot out my loyal deeds which I have performed for the house of my God and its services. So just like we read at the end of chapter 12, that all during the days of Zerubbabel and Nehemiah, they paid for the Levites and they paid for the priests. As soon as Nehemiah leaves, it's gone. He comes back and they haven't been paid for. And you can look at the reason that they were willing to pay for the Levites. Back in 1244, Judah rejoiced over the priests and Levites who served. They rejoiced over all those times that they could get together and celebrate the word of God and celebrate God himself and what he was doing. But now Nehemiah is gone, and he's got to come back, and they haven't been paying for the Levites and priests because that's obviously not a big deal anymore. Verse 15. In those days I saw in Judah some who were treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in sacks of grain and loading them on donkeys, as well as wine, grapes, and figs, and all kinds of loads, and they brought them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So I admonished them on the day they sold food. Also men of Tyre were living there who imported fish and all kinds of merchandise and sold them to the sons of Judah on the Sabbath, even in Jerusalem. Then I reprimanded the nobles of Judah and said to them, "What is this evil thing that you're doing by profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers do the same, so that our God brought on us and on this city all this trouble? Yet you're adding to the wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath." And it came about just as it grew dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and that they should not open them until after the Sabbath. And he's going to go on and explain what he does there. Closest thing I can think of to kind of get an example of how drastic Nehemiah is being, and rightly so. The gates of the city then are almost like exits and on-ramps and off-ramps to a city now. And if people were coming in and out of Monroe for, markets or to sell or whatever, and you went up to 522 and you got to the access points where you can go by the roundabout and you can go over by Starbucks, and you coned it off and put a big, huge truck or something in the way so that nobody could drive into or out of Monroe for an entire day. More or less, that's the type of stuff that Nehemiah is doing. He's going there and putting a roadblock in front of them and saying, you guys cannot cross over this line. If you're not an Israelite, if you're not a Jew, you do not cross over this line to do business on the Sabbath day. And if you do, I will see to it that I get you kicked out of here. And so he goes on, and so they've neglected the Sabbath day. Then in verse 21, in those days I also saw that the Jews had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. As for their children, half spoke in the language of Ashdod, and none of them was able to speak the language of Judah, but the language of his own people. So I contended with them and cursed them and struck some of them and pulled out their hair and made them swear by God, "You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take of their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. Did not Solomon, the king of Israel, sin regarding these things? Yet among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, the foreign women caused even him to sin. Do we then hear about you and all that you've committed, this great evil, by acting unfaithfully against our God, by marrying foreign women?" And then it goes on to explain how even Sanballat was married in. Then in verse 29, "Remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. Thus I purified them from everything foreign and appointed duties for the priests and the Levites, each in his task. And I arranged for the supply of wood at appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good." And that's where the book ends. The situation he explains here had gotten so bad that when he went back to Jerusalem, you've got all these people who had married the Ashdodites, and their children, half of them could speak that language, but none of them could speak in the language of Judah anymore. So they had the native language of wherever they lived. They had the Ashdodite language because they married into it, but then they couldn't even speak the language of Judah anymore. And that's how drastic things had gotten. So he pulls men out and very abruptly uses physical force with them to try to get them back in line, and talks about Solomon. And look how great Solomon was, and yet the wives took him away. Something I want to go to, look back at chapter 11. Notice that the first issue in chapter 13 is that the temple was neglected. That's the first thing that Nehemiah brings up. Look in, oh, you know what? I put chapter 11. Chapter 10. Look in chapter 10, in the very last verse, the very last phrase, the very end of their oath to God about what they were going to do because they read the book of the law. The last phrase there, thus we will not neglect the house of our God. So that's what they closed off their oath with. Nehemiah comes back to Jerusalem after this oath has been put in place, and that's the first thing he mentions that's wrong. The second thing in chapter 13 is that they neglected the tithing. They neglected paying the Levites and priests. They neglected the money for the temple. Look just back one step to the second to last thing in that oath. In verse 34, likewise, we cast lots for the supply of wood among the priests, the Levites, and the people, so they might bring it to the house of God. And then in verse 35, that they might bring the first fruits of our ground, the first fruits of the fruit of every tree to the house of the Lord annually. And they go on and they explain. And then in verse 37, we will also bring the first of our dough, our contributions, the fruit of every tree, new wine and the oil to the priests and the chamber of the house of our God, and the tithe of our ground to the Levites, for the Levites are they who receive the tithes in all the rural towns. So they neglected that. The next thing that they neglected was the Sabbath. Look backwards just one step in that oath. In verse 32 of chapter 10, we also placed ourselves under... Oh, that's not far enough back. Let me find the right verse. 31 is the verse I'm looking for. As for the peoples of the land who bring wares or any grain on the Sabbath day to sell, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or a holy day, and we will forego the crops the seventh year and the exaction of every debt. So they ignored that one. And the final one, they were neglecting marriage. They were not marrying among the Jews. They were marrying outside of the Jews. Now look at the start of the oath. In verse 28, I'll just start reading there. Now the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, and the singers, and the temple servants, and all those who had separated themselves from the peoples of the lands to the law of God, their wives, and it goes on in verse 29, are joining with their kinsmen, their nobles, and are taking on themselves a curse and an oath to walk in God's law, which was given them through Moses, God's servant, to keep and observe all the commandments of the God our Lord and his ordinances and statutes, and that we will not give our daughters to the peoples of the land or take their daughters for our sons. So they committed themselves to 4 different things in that oath. And Nehemiah comes back, and there's specifically 4 things that they are clearly not doing. And that's how the book ends. And it's depressing, and I kind of have to wrestle with it. And it's like when Solomon says, with more wisdom comes more grief. I like to be optimistic about things. I like to look at it and go, oh yeah, Nehemiah's going to have a happy ending. I mean, he did everything right, and God was clearly with him. God did everything right. But Nehemiah still comes back, and there's still all these issues. Because at the end of the day, people have free reign, and they chose to go their own way. I kind of liken this class to if Oliver was up here giving the announcements and had to announce a wedding and a death in the same one. I wish I could go and do the sad one first and then do the happy one next so we could end on a happy note. But that's not the way this book is organized. It ends on actually a really depressing note. However, I'm going to do a class next week, and we're going to overview the whole book, and it hopefully won't be that depressing. But nonetheless, that is the way that the book of Nehemiah ends, so we'll close there.